Nefertiti's face has always been the certainty. Everything else has been the question. The painted limestone bust, 47 centimeters tall, excavated on the 6th of December, 1912 from a buried sculptor's workshop in the desert city of Amarna, is among the most reproduced works of art the ancient world left behind. Ludwig Borchardt, the German archaeologist who lifted it from the rubble that evening, wrote a single sentence in his excavation diary when he understood what he was holding. "No use describing it," he wrote. "You have to see it." That diary still exists. The entry is still legible, and the face it describes has looked out from museum walls and magazine covers and documentary thumbnails for over a century, presenting itself as a solved case. It was never a solved case. The face was found. The woman behind it was not. What science has accomplished in the decades since that December evening is something quieter and more precise than discovery. It has drawn a border. Through mitochondrial analysis, CT imaging, genetic fingerprinting, and population genomics, through 11 royal mummies tested in the Journal of the American Medical Association, through the first whole genome ever extracted from dynastic Egypt, the science has eliminated every wrong answer. And when you eliminate every wrong answer, what remains, however improbable it might feel, is the direction of the truth. There is a maternal bloodline at the center of this story. It is called Haplogroup K. Hold that designation. In the sections that follow, what it connects across 3,000 years of dynastic history, across the full breadth of the ancient Near East, will become impossible to dismiss. Stay with this. What the record shows has taken a century to assemble. The accepted account of Nefertiti begins with plenitude and ends with silence. She was a great royal wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who reigned over Egypt during the 14th century before the Common Era, in what historians consider the country's most materially opulent period. She bore him 6 daughters, Meritaten, Meketaten, Enkesenamen, Neferneferurin Tashrit, Neferneferur, and Setapenra, all named, all depicted, all verifiable to the surviving reliefs of Amarna's limestone walls. She was not merely a consort. The temple carvings show her performing rites previously reserved for pharaohs alone. She smites enemies on relief panels. She drives a chariot. She presents offerings directly to the solar disk without her husband beside her. By the 12th regnal year of Akhenaten's reign, she may have been elevated formally to co-regent. After his death, the scholarly consensus increasingly holds that she briefly ruled Egypt herself under the throne named Nefertiti, before the boy Tutankhamun succeeded her. She was powerful. She was documented. She was, for a time, arguably the most prominent human being on Earth. And then she vanishes, not gradually, not with the slow attrition of historical forgetting. She simply stops appearing in dated inscriptions after the 16th regnal year of Akhenaten's reign, and even that last confirmed appearance came from a graffito written in red ochre on a limestone quarry wall, not from any official monument. The first crack in the accepted account is not about her disappearance. It is about her arrival. Not a single inscription in the entire surviving corpus of Amarna-era Egyptian writing identifies Nefertiti's parents. No stele names her mother. No tomb text names her father. The title carried by the courtier eye, God's father, has been interpreted by many Egyptologists as meaning father-in-law to Pharaoh, which would make Nefertiti's biological father. His wife Te held the title nurse of the great royal wife, which might describe a birth mother, a stepmother, a wet nurse, or a governess. These are 4 entirely different biological relationships. The Egyptological literature has treated them as essentially interchangeable for decades. A court that recorded the dimensions of temple foundations in 5-line inscriptions written in red ochre on quarry walls left no record of who gave birth to the woman who stood beside the pharaoh. That is not an oversight. In the administrative culture of ancient Egypt, that is a choice or an erasure. Joan Fletcher was not looking for Nefertiti's mummy. She was studying ancient Egyptian hair. Fletcher, then a specialist in ancient hair at the University of York in England, had spent years building a scholarly framework for understanding how hair was used as a marker of social identity, ritual status, and cultural belonging in ancient Egypt. It was specific, methodical work, far from celebrity archaeology of headline-generating tomb openings. In the course of that research, she returned to the tomb designated KV-35 in the Valley of the Kings, a cache discovered by the French archaeologist Victor Loret in 1898. Inside were multiple cached royal mummies, displaced from their original tombs by ancient priests protecting them from robbers. Among the cached mummies was a woman known only as a younger lady. Her face had been deliberately and violently damaged, a wound inflicted before the mummification process was complete, suggesting it occurred in life or immediately after death. She wore a distinctive wig style. On the 9th of June, 2003, Fletcher announced publicly that she believed this damaged, unnamed woman was Nefertiti. The announcement triggered one of the most contentious disputes in recent Egyptological history. Zahi Hawass, then Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, rejected the identification and temporarily revoked Fletcher's excavation permit. The disagreement was fierce, but the methodology that eventually settled it was not opinion. It was genetics. Hawass subsequently led his own research project, the Egyptian Mummy Project, which subjected 11 royal mummies to DNA fingerprinting and CT analysis. The results were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in February of 2010. The younger lady was not Nefertiti. The science was specific. Her mitochondrial DNA matched Tutankhamun's, placing her as a biological mother, an unnamed daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai. She was Nefertiti's contemporary, possibly her sister-in-law. She was not the queen. This is the first track of evidence, and its conclusion matters more than it initially appears. The younger lady had been the strongest candidate for Nefertiti's physical remains. She was ruled out. That elimination did not close the investigation. It redirected it toward two other nameless women in a separate tomb, discovered by an archaeologist who was looking for something else entirely, found in conditions so damaged by flood and time that the science required another decade to catch up with the question. The second track of evidence begins not in the Valley of the Kings but in a laboratory, and it starts with a precedent that Egyptology had not fully absorbed. In 2018, researchers from the University of Manchester published a genetic analysis of two mummies held at the Manchester Museum, known since their discovery in 1907 as the Two Brothers. The two men, Nakdank and Knumnak, had been buried together in a high-status tomb at Derrife during Egypt's 12th dynasty, and their coffin inscriptions named the same woman as their mother. For over a century, the morphological differences between their skulls had caused scholars to doubt whether they were actually brothers at all. The DNA settled it definitively. Both men shared the mitochondrial haplogroup M101, confirming a common mother, but their Y chromosome sequences differed. They had different fathers. They were half-brothers. The relationship inscribed on their coffins was true. The biology was more complex than expected. This study matters here because it established something the field needed, that ancient Egyptian mummy DNA, when extractable, can resolve relationships with precision, and that the answer the DNA gives is not always the answer the textual record implies. Now consider the maternal bloodline of Nefertiti's family by marriage. The genetic study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2010 established a 5-generation pedigree for Tutankhamun's immediate family. One of its most consistent findings was the persistence of a single mitochondrial haplogroup running through the maternal line of the 18th dynasty, haplogroup K. It was present in Thuya, the great-grandmother, and it descended through Queen Tai, through the younger lady, and into Tutankhamun himself. Haplogroup K is the forward lock this account placed in the opening section, and this is where it opens. Haplogroup K originated in the Near East or Anatolia during the late glacial period and spread westward to the Levant and into Europe with early Neolithic farmers. It is today found at elevated frequencies in populations across the Mediterranean, the Levant, and, notably, in approximately 30% of people with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, a frequency that geneticists attribute to the haplogroup's deep roots in ancient Near Eastern populations before any diaspora event. In the 14th century BC, it was a maternal signature of the most powerful royal family in the world. The question that the science cannot yet answer is where that maternal line entered the dynasty, and whether Nefertiti was part of it or the source of it. This is where the two tracks meet. One track moved through the dramatic and contested identification attempts, Fletcher's announcement, Hawass's rebuttal, the DNA study that ruled out the younger lady and established who she actually was. The other track moved through the genetic laboratory, through the Two Brothers study that proved ancient Egyptian mummy DNA can resolve identity questions with precision, and into maternal haplogroup K running continuously through the female line of the 18th dynasty. Both tracks arrive at the same address, Tomb KV-21 in the Valley of the Kings, where two nameless royal women have waited, in conditions of increasing damage and fragmentation, since their original discovery by Giovanni Belzoni in 1817. The DNA analysis conducted on both mummies as part of the Egyptian Mummy Project produced a result that was statistically confirmed. The woman designated KV-21 as shared DNA markers with Tutankhamun's two stillborn daughters, found buried in his tomb. She was almost certainly their mother. She was almost certainly Akhenaten, Nefertiti's own daughter, the widow who later wrote a desperate letter to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma, begging for a son to marry. The woman designated KV-21 showed a close maternal relationship to KV-21A. If KV-21 is Akhenaten, Nefertiti's daughter, then KV-21B is a mother. The haplogroup K maternal line, running downward from Thuya through the dynasty, would be expected to appear in both women if the identification holds. The DNA yield from KV-21B was insufficient for a full identification. Insufficient is not the same as absent. It is not the same as negative. It is a language of preservation failure in a tomb flooded repeatedly over 200 years, of a body damaged by water, by thieves who appear to have removed the head of companion mummy and partially damaged KV-21B's skull in the same attempt. Now consider the living communities who carry haplogroup K today. In the Levant, across Anatolia, through the populations whose ancestors walked the same corridor that the Mitanni diplomatic missions traveled to the Egyptian court in the 14th century before the Common Era, their maternal inheritance is not a historical abstraction. It moves in living cells. Whether it connects to the woman in KV-21B is the question the science has not yet had the preserved material to answer. The absence of Nefertiti's biological record was not a failure of ancient Egyptian record-keeping. It was the outcome of the system. The post-Amarna erasure known by the Latin phrase damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, was one of the most systematic acts of state-sanctioned historiographical destruction the ancient world produced. It was executed primarily under Pharaoh Horemheb, the general who came to power after the deaths of Tutankhamun, I and the last of the Amarna line. Horemheb dismantled the limestone temples of Amarna and repurposed their blocks as fill material inside later construction at Karnak. He struck the names of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Tutankhamun, and I from official king lists. He claimed their regnal years as his own, so that subsequent dynasties counted directly from Amenhotep, the third to Horemheb, as if none of the reigns between had occurred. The temples of the Aten were demolished. The city of Amarna was abandoned, stripped, and left to the desert. The records most likely to have identified Nefertiti's parentage, the genealogical inscriptions of the Amarna court, the administrative documentation of a royal family across 17 years of reform, were among the primary targets of this erasure. When a political system systematically destroys a regime's records, it destroys the biographical traces of every person associated with that regime. Nefertiti's parentage was not mysterious to the people who recorded it. The records simply did not survive the reigns that came after. Nefertiti's case is not unique in its structure. It is unique only in the prominence of the name attached to it. The Amarna period produced dozens of documented cases in which women of the royal and noble household lost their biographical traces through deliberate political erasure rather than natural historical attrition. Egyptologists refer to this category collectively as the anonymous royals of the Amarna cache, women whose physical remains survive in some cases, when their names did not. Among the most powerful women the ancient world produced, women who ruled provinces, conducted diplomatic negotiations, managed temple economies, and in at least 2 documented cases ascended the throne itself. There are figures whose identities survive only as question marks beside bone measurements and haplogroup classifications. This is not an ancient problem. It is the most modern problem there is. It is what happens when a political system decides that a chapter of history should not be remembered. The legacy that the evidence cannot diminish belongs entirely to her. Whatever her origins, whether she was born in the provincial nobility of Akhmim, whether she arrived at the Egyptian court from the Mitanni kingdom of northern Syria, whether she was a biological daughter of the man who would eventually succeed Tutankhamun on the throne, what Nefertiti built in her lifetime was hers. She governed alongside a pharaoh who was dismantling 3,000 years of religious tradition, and she did not merely accompany that revolution. She was depicted as its engine, the temples that bore her name, the 6 daughters whose faces appear in the surviving reliefs alongside their mothers, each one named, each one documented, each one a proof that Nefertiti existed in full. The brief reign under a throne name that may or may not have been hers, in which the fractured machinery of a shattered dynasty was held together long enough for a child king to take the crown. Whatever the science eventually confirms about the woman in Tomb KV-21b, none of that changes the work she did. What does remain unresolved, and what the evidence, however it accumulates, may never fully answer, is the question beneath the question. Not where she was born, but what that means. The ancient Near East in the 14th century before the Common Era was not a collection of hermetically sealed national identities. It was a corridor of movement, of diplomatic marriage, of women sent across deserts with lavish retinues to marry into the households of foreign kings, to learn foreign languages, to absorb foreign theologies, and to become, in the official record, whatever political system required them to be. If Nefertiti came from outside Egypt's borders, she was not unusual. She was one of dozens in a single generation. The excavation diary that Borchardt wrote on the evening of the 6th of December, 1912, is still legible. "No use describing it," he wrote. "You have to see it." He was describing the surface, the painted eye, the rendered collarbone, the serene, improbable precision of face rendered in limestone over 3,000 years ago. He was not describing the woman. He could not. Nobody could. The science has spent a century trying. The face still stares back, perfect and complete, from its case in Berlin. The rest remains the silence she was given.